this is going to require a bit of additional research from your side. A lot of the content in all likelihood will not be in your textbook, so it's important that you pay attention to specifically the legislation here. So my suggestion would be that you actually go ahead and look at the legislation before making a decision here in terms of what specific task you or option under the task you would like to address. You can see there you've got three options, and again, as with all the other tasks, this is related to your specific company that you chose. So that needs to feature in your discussion somehow. So you are looking at a legally defensible and effective diversity management strategy, or you are looking at requirements and impact of diversity in government legislation, or you are looking at why sexual harassment and the ramification of sexual harassment should be considered in the workplace and in workplace policies. Now, if we look at the first option there, you will need to go and find the legislation and indicate how that would impact on your hiring practices in the organization, in your promotion practices in the organization. Because if you are using practices that are contrary to the actual legislation, that can land you into trouble. With regard to the second option, you'll need to go and look at the specific legislation itself and how that legislation is designed to impact on diversity in the workplace. So those are the two legislative questions, or heavy legislative aspects. The sexual harassment's also legislated, and all of this, by the way, uses exactly the same legislation. I will speak about the legislation on the next slide, but they all use exactly the same legislation. The last one there, the sexual harassment, you are just going to change your angle a little bit, because a lot of your focus there will be on case studies that are in existence. So when we're talking about diversity, specifically in legislation, the first thing that comes to mind would be the Constitution. And remember, all of your legislation is based on the Constitution itself. So not just labor law, but all your legislation that exists in the country is first and foremost guided by the Constitution. Now, if we look at the labor law aspect, which is what we're looking at here in this instance, we're looking at the Employment Equity Act being guided by the Constitution. So the Constitution is the overarching act that governs all other legislation, and in this instance, all other labor legislation. So whatever you've got in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, whatever you've got in the Labor Relations Act, whatever you've got in the Employment Equity Act, it cannot be contradictory to the Constitution. So if you go look at the Constitution, you will see that there are certain things mentioned in the Employment Equity Act that comes directly from the Constitution. And specifically here, it's amongst other things, the clause where they say you are not allowed to unfairly discriminate against a person. Now, please note that the fact that they mention unfairly discriminate means that there is something such as fair discrimination. Now, the implication for you, therefore, is if you are doing option 1 or 2, that needs to be featured somewhere in your answer. That there is, in fact, something like fair discrimination. And you will need to determine what that is and discuss what that is in the context of your organization. Also, with regards to these acts, there have been a number of amendments that have been promulgated. So make sure that you've got the latest copy of the act when you are discussing this, because that's what we're looking for in the answer. If you're answering option 1 or option 2 here, you need to use the very latest legislation. And to that effect, you can actually go to the Department of Labor's website. They've done a relatively good job in terms of keeping you up to date, or keeping up to date in terms of the new legislation. There's been some changes there. Also, you can look at a site like Labour Guide. They're very good. And also, Labour Guide will definitely be useful for the third option, which is the sexual harassment provisions. So what I would suggest, if you're using option 1 and 2, make sure that you've got, or 1 or 2, sorry, don't do both. If you're using or selecting to do either option 1 or option 2, get a copy of the Constitution, get a copy of the very latest Employment Equity Act, gather a list of sources, websites. There are a lot of websites, legal websites, that the Rebus, etc., Labour Guide, that are very good in terms of providing guidance in terms of the labor legislation. So go and look at those sites. They have a lot of interesting articles usually, and what I also like about those sites is they explain it in plain, simple language. So they don't speak legalese. They don't use high and mighty legal terms that Joe Soap doesn't understand. So use those sites to guide you in terms of what you need to discuss and what the concepts mean. In terms of the last option that you've got, the sexual harassment provisions, there are a lot of case studies on this. A few years ago, there were quite a few cases that went as far as the Labour Court, and there were some very strict judgments that were made by the judges in those instances in terms of the responsibility of the employer in terms of protecting employees against sexual harassment practices. And also, again, if you go and look at the Employment Equity Act, one of the things that they define in the Employment Equity Act is, in fact, what sexual harassment is. So if you are doing the third option, you will need to give me a definition of what sexual harassment is in terms of our legislation. We are not looking at this from a criminal aspect. We are looking at this from a labor law aspect. So you need to go and look at the Employment Equity Act. As I said, it very clearly defines what constitutes sexual harassment. So make sure that is your starting point. And then go look at the recent case studies on this in terms of what the judges have said in terms of responsibility of employer itself. And note they place a very heavy burden on the employer with regards to this. So go and look at that and make sure that is addressed in your actual discussion. Also important to note here, again, you're referencing citations throughout. Make sure that you look at how we actually reference legislation, because legislation, especially in this instance, we are looking at the government being the publisher, the government being the author. So your author for all the labor legislation here will be the Department of Labor. The Constitution will be the South African government, but the authors for your Employment Equity Act or any other labor legislation you might choose to use will be the South African Department of Labor, or just Department of Labor is fine, with the relevant year, the act, and the act number. So just be aware of that, and your location will be Cape Town, and the publisher will be government printers. I will also, as part of this exercise, I will put up a little note on how to reference the legislation, because I know that you don't actually do legislation in detail. It's not the majority of your course here. So I would expect that from the labor relations guys, which is very labor law heavy. I would expect them to know this. You guys don't really do it, so I will just put up a little guidance in terms of how to reference this. Because as I said, the reference for the legislation itself looks slightly different than a normal journal article. And by the way, there is also a lot that has been written thesis-wise, article-wise by universities, journal-wise about these things. And a rebus is a legal journal that you have access to via the IIE library. So I would suggest that you do consult with that with regards to this question.